the Edwardian Christmas of 1905. A crumpet crisp December folds itself neatly over the rooftops of Britain, laced with just the right amount of soot and sparkles. Gas lamps flicker like dozing stars, and the air, ever so slightly tinged with the scent of roasting chestnuts and damp wool, carries the murmur of a world half buttoned into modernity and half dozing in horse-drawn tradition. Let us begin then, in the parlour of the Higgins family. Their home stands demurely among the soot-sprinkled rows of red brick terraces in a town that never makes the headlines, but somehow always makes the tea on time. It is December 23rd, 1905, and something deeply thrilling is afoot. Namely, Mr. Gerald Higgins has just retrieved the Christmas pudding from storage, a dark cannonball-shaped relic that has been aging in the larder since August and could, in theory, be used to sink small naval vessels. Now, you must understand, this pudding is not just dessert. It is a feat of domestic engineering, held together by the unwavering spirit of suet and colonial spice. As Gerald sets it ceremoniously upon the kitchen table, Mrs. Higgins gives it a fond pat with the intensity reserved only for her children and well-behaved kettles. The parlour, meanwhile, is slowly blooming with the faint pine and wax aroma of the Christmas greenery. The Edwardian era was particularly keen on decorations that looked like they could sprout roots and reclaim the furniture if left alone too long. Mistletoe is balanced precariously on a gas sconce, which one child has already nearly set alight with a paper crown. Ivy snakes along the mantelpiece in a way that would make a modern interior decorator weep gently into their minimalist throw pillows. And out in the street, the carolers have begun. Now, Edwardian caroling was not for the faint of heart, nor for those short on mufflers. A mix of angelic schoolchildren and one particularly robust baritone grocer tramps along in the frost, delivering joy with the volume of a brass band and the dress sense of Dickensian time travellers. They sing not only the old songs, God rest ye merry, gentlemen, which no one quite knows where to put the comma, but also newer, heart-stirring tunes of the time, like the Holy City, which is less about Bethlehem and more about vibrato. Inside, young Thomas Higgins has crafted a Christmas card using an alarming amount of glue and well-meaning innocence. Christmas cards in 1905 were reaching an artistic peak of sorts, featuring odd and whimsically unsettling pairings like frogs, ice skating with turnips, or kittens attending church in waistcoats. Sentimentality and strangeness walked hand in hand, which really is the ideal vibe for the holidays. The postman lumbers along his snowy route like a wool-clad Santa in training, the mailbag bulging with telegrams, parcels wrapped in brown paper, and hopeful letters to distant aunts. For many Edwardians, this was not just the season of giving. It was the season of deciphering your cousin's handwriting to work out whether Aunt Mildred was getting plum cake or plumbing equipment. Back in the kitchen, the kettle sings an operatic little whistle as Mrs. Higgins prepares the late evening tea. Tea, during this age, was the beginning, middle, and end of nearly every social occasion, facial expression, or minor household disagreement. Do you feel ill-tempered? Have tea. Feel sentimental? Tea. Mildly existential about the slow collapse of the British Empire? Sit down. Let's brew something strong. Outside, the stars begin to appear one by one, like children being called to supper. The night descends gently over chimneys and cobbles, wrapping everything in a hush that isn't quite silence. It has the soft rustle of expectations, the crinkle of wax paper, the creak of an old cupboard where presents are hidden, and the low murmur of hopes tied up with bits of string. Christmas in 1905 was quieter than today, yes. There were no blinking light displays or endlessly looping songs in every shop. But it wasn't small. It was rich with rituals. Folding napkins, slicing oranges, simmering wine, and thumbing over hymnals while listening for sleigh bells that, let's be honest, were almost certainly just a neighbour's coal delivery. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Outside the Higgins parlour, the snow begins to fall in earnest, a quiet, fluttering promise. And somewhere, just beyond the gas glow, something stirs that will turn tomorrow into Christmas. If you'd been fortunate, or depending on your temperament, unfortunate enough, to find yourself ambling through Edwardian England in December of 1905, the first thing you might notice wouldn't be the swathes of crisp frost kissed onto every leaf, or the muffled jingle of distant bells, or even the ever-looming plume of coal smoke trying its best to pretend it wasn't slowly ending every chimney sweep's career. No, you'd likely notice the smell. Edwardian Christmas smelled complex. A bold brew of coal fires, orange peels, boiling puddings, overcooked sprouts, and something delightfully musty, an aroma passed down from a time when people still believed absinthe was a health drink. This was a century still polishing the silver from the Victorians, and the scent of tradition, glory, and last week's roast chicken clung to every surface like ivy on a vicarage wall. December days were brief and frequently overcast. Great news for people who enjoyed gas lamps, lukewarm light, and pretending it was 7 p.m. at 2 in the afternoon. All across the far-flung empire, Britain prepared itself for festivities in ways both charming and bewildering. In drawing rooms and parlours, names given to rooms where very little drawing or parlouring actually occurred. Families were beginning their slow, sentimental descent into the Christmas season. For starters, the holiday calendar was already full of events whose purpose outweighed their practicality. There's a certain British genius to the idea of dragging greenery indoors in midwinter and then spending an entire afternoon acting surprised by how many spiders came with it. Mistletoe, holly, and the aggressively named kissing bough were not so much decor as they were seasonal treaties. Kissing beneath one wasn't just expected, it was essentially plant-mandated affection. And then there was the ritual of writing Christmas cards. In 1905, these glittering paper rectangles were the TikToks of their day, sent out en masse to remind distant cousins you were still alive, and crucially, that you had taste enough to purchase cards embossed with doves, cherubic children, and fat robins perched on branches somehow resisting the laws of physics. With the booming postal system delivering mail up to 6 times a day in London, Edwardians could post a card in the morning and still receive a reply by tea time, which makes modern response times feel hilariously glacial. Some cards, though, were delightfully odd. A favourite theme involved anthropomorphic frogs ice skating in waistcoats while juggling presents. Others included sentimental poetry so thick with sap, one could mistake it for tree resin. Still, it was the thought that counted, even if that thought was, "Here, have this disturbing image of 2 pigs in bonnets sledding into a pond." Evenings, though, were where Edwardian Christmas truly shimmered. Without smartphones, or even an understanding of what Wi-Fi might be, families turned inward. Parlour games became the social glue of the season. There was the Minister's Cat, a game where each person took turns adding ever-changing adjectives to describe a fictional feline. The minister's cat, you'd hear, was a boisterous cat, then a courageous cat, until someone cracked and said something like xerophilic, prompting an argument about whether words invented on the spot counted. Of course, Christmas stockings were firmly in fashion, though as yet unoffended by transactionalism. They were hung, not by the chimney with care, but usually by the gas fire, with a healthy dose of anxiety about spontaneous combustion. A tangerine was considered lavish, a walnut was a small miracle, and a niche item like a carved toy mouse, worth an entire week's gossip. Perhaps most delightful of all was the revelling in customs themselves. Edwardians adored a custom. They could turn nearly anything into one: tea at 4, hats at weddings, disapproving stares at anything remotely French. But at Christmas, their love of ritual reached poetic levels. The stirring of the Christmas pudding, for instance, was done with the entire family, taking turns rotating the mixture clockwise for luck. Occasionally, silver coins were slipped inside, which added just enough risk of dental disaster to keep things interesting. In cities like York and Bath, carolers began appearing on street corners, shaking handfuls of sleigh bells with the conviction of a small-town orchestra short on brass. Mulled wine was dispensed from enamel pots, typically tasting of warm cloves and mild regret, while snow, if they were lucky enough to have a dusting, turned cobblestones into a charming but treacherous obstacle course. Early 20th century boots, after all, had the grip and insulation of a laced-up tea towel. Inside, however, where the fire hissed and curtains hung like sleepy sentinels, homes glowed with a quiet sort of contentment. Candles twinkled on carefully positioned sideboards. A cat might be curled into itself beside the hearth, radiating judgment and warmth in equal measure. And over in the corner, the gramophone, wheeled out on special occasions and cranked dutifully until the room spun with the sound of warbly tenors, and nobody dared breathe too loudly for fear of knocking the needle off its gently spinning tune. It was against this backdrop that the season gently unfolded, not with a bang or a bauble blast, but with the rustle of wrapping paper, the warm chorus of shared songs, the faint creak of a floorboard stepped on just one too many times. And as the Edwardian moon cast its soft silver on frosted panes, our next quiet curiosity awaited, hidden deep inside something delightfully absurd, the grand tradition of the Christmas pantomime, where men dressed as women, children screamed at shadows, and logic politely excused itself until January. Outside, the frost lay thick on cobblestones and chimney stacks, like the icing on a particularly proud fruitcake. Edwardian England in December was a place of quiet purpose, where the sun was more of a polite guest than a permanent resident. Its brief visits cast long champagne-coloured shadows over gloved hands and fur-trimmed coats. Inside, however, the homes were beginning their transformation, from respectable, soot-dusted parlors into festive sanctuaries of baubles, evergreens, and a slightly over-ambitious enthusiasm for plum pudding. In 1905, the average middle-class home did not so much explode into Christmas glee as it politely opened the front door to it, offered it a sherry, and asked it to please remove its boots before stepping on the Turkish rug. The spirit of the season was quietly refined, with a side of sardonic cheer. Decorations, for instance, were carefully curated. Tinsel hadn't quite hit its golden hour. It wouldn't shine its metallic mischief until slightly later in the century. Instead, households favoured handcrafted paper chains in soft pastels and tissue paper rosettes, drooping gracefully from picture rails. Holly and ivy were stubborn regulars, of course, Britain being Britain. Anything prickly and evergreen got a warm welcome in winter. Mistletoe, hung with great ceremony over doorways, was both a botanical curiosity and a socio-romantic landmine. One wrong step, and suddenly one had been kissed by Cousin Edwin, whose moustache was both expansive and unfortunately waxed. And as for the Christmas tree, the arboreal monarch of the season, it had been planted firmly in British tradition, thanks to Prince Albert some decades earlier, with Queen Victoria nodding politely as ever. By 1905, even the most sceptical of households had conceded to dragging an evergreen indoors. Trees were placed with great theatricality in the drawing room, dressed in ribbons, candles, yes, actual open flames on foliage. What could go wrong? And glass ornaments that supremely disapproved of gravity. The brave few even attempted to balance a small porcelain angel on top, resulting in several instances of porcelain angels flying unceremoniously into bowls of trifle. But perhaps the coziest transformation of them all was the soundscape. As Christmas approached, parlors filled with the delicate clink of teacups, the rustle of card games, and the soft harmonies of carols sung in warm, layered harmonies. The Edwardians, ever the fans of a to-do, revived ancient Yuletide songs with scholarly affection. Think The Holly and the Ivy, God Rest Ye Merry, Gentlemen, and the occasional irreverent ditty composed by an uncle who'd enjoyed too much port. And what of the cards, you ask? Oh, the gloriously odd Christmas cards. In 1905, the Edwardian post was suffering under the sheer weight of hand-delivered seasonal sentiments. This was a golden age of postal overachievement. Cards bearing heartfelt wishes and disturbing illustrations of anthropomorphic frogs riding bicycles flooded mantelpieces across the country. A Victorian hangover, perhaps, but the Edwardians ran with it, penning verses so florid that even the roses blushed. Among these rituals, fires crackled with determined warmth in iron grates. The fire was the centerpiece of the Edwardian sitting room, worshipped by households as the original and most flattering filter. You may have had chilblains on your toes and a draft in your underclothes, but if you sat close enough to the fire with a cup of mulled wine, everything felt tolerably civilized. And above all this, drifting like sugar on a steamed pudding, was the unspoken magic of long winter evenings, the kind where time stretched out like a cat in front of the hearth. Children listened wide-eyed to ghost stories. Yes, ghost stories. For Christmas was once as much about spectres as it was about stockings. Adults debated the consistency of custard, and snow, when it fell, muffled even the clatter of horse hooves and the occasional pigeon panicking over its poor life choices. In this hush of domestic celebration, Christmas in 1905 wasn't loud. It was thoughtful. It was paisley dressing gowns and shadowy corners lit by flickering candles, the tick of the long case clock and the scent of pine needling your socks. And quietly, beneath all the merriment, something else was beginning to rustle. The preparations for the feast. The banquet, the spread, the feast day that would demand all available ovens and summon every available Aunt Doris. But that, dear listener, is a tale best shared once the mince pies have cooled and the kitchen truly comes alive. To truly understand the quiet delights of a proper Edwardian Christmas, one must first appreciate the genteel chaos of the drawing room, the heart of festive domestic theatre in 1905. It is here, late on a frosted December morning, that stockings lay limp and newly unwrapped, half forgotten as the real business of the holiday finally begins. The polite parading of gifts, the annual groaning at Aunt Ethel's joke book, and the dignified battle over who gets to read aloud from the illustrated London news. The drawing room was the Edwardian equivalent of our modern-day living room, only with far more antimacassars per square inch. Antimacassars, if you've never had the pleasure, were little lace doilies placed lovingly over furniture. Their role, a noble, if unsung one, was to protect fine upholstery from the pomaded heads of dandified uncles. In their own way, they were the heroes of the holiday season. Imagine the bravery of a thin lace square standing between your cream Chesterfield and Cousin Percy's hair oil. Spine-tingling stuff. By midday, voices rose and then fell, like the snow shaking loose from the unimaginably stiff brim of someone's bowler hat. Conversation during an Edwardian Christmas gathering often tread the cautious line between spirited cheer and firmly repressed grievances. Family members would sit on horsehair-stuffed settees, sipping tea that had been brewed strong enough to stand up and fight, exchanging views on the King's latest speech, or Mrs. Featherstone's scandalous new hat at morning church. Outrageous. It had feathers, several of them. Children, having torn through stockings at what anyone over 30 would call an ungodly hour, were now experiencing the terminal sugar crash of plum pudding and peppermint creams. It was customary by then to herd them into a corner with a new puzzle, a hornpipe instruction booklet, or, for especially optimistic parents, a well-meant but terminally unfunny Punch and Judy puppet set. There's nothing quite like the joy of watching a 6-year-old beat a wooden crocodile with a stick while arguing about Victorian moral values with a glove puppet. Meanwhile, deeper into the house, behind carved walnut doors and thick velvet portieres, the older generation was beginning to dabble in that most sacred of Christmas rituals, dozing upright in high-backed chairs. These were not naps, mind you. Oh no. These were acts of genteel contemplation with closed eyes and only occasional snoring. Great Aunt Clara, having dozed off mid-conversation about the poor state of railway punctuality, was now dreaming peacefully of Swindon timetables and goose-down slippers. It's worth pausing here to reflect on just how many layers the average Edwardian individual had to contend with before achieving a nap-induced bliss. First, the corsetry, tight enough to qualify as infrastructure. Then layers of wool, stiff collars, silk cravats, waistcoats adorned with watch chains, and, for the ladies, blouses fastened with buttons so small they required divine intervention. Getting comfortable in such an outfit was practically an Olympic event. And yet, they managed it, because nothing stands between an Edwardian lady and her bonus blanket of a port sherry lullaby. Outside, the skies hung low and solemn over frost-blanketed gardens. A robin, plump with breadcrumbs and the inflated ego of seasonal branding, hopped along the stone wall near the conservatory. This was not an unusual sight. In fact, robins had gained such a foothold in the Christmas aesthetic that they graced nearly every holiday card, smirking slightly, as if to say, yes, that's right, I am the main character. Back inside, the scent of cloves and boiled fruit drifted down the corridors, with the unmistakable hint of a steamed pudding in progress, a culinary centerpiece that took hours to prepare and roughly 5 minutes to demolish. It was customary to hide a sixpence in the depths of the Christmas pudding, though the odds of chipping a molar in the discovery saw many a family dentist toasted come Boxing Day. The fortunate, or unfortunate, depending on your dental confidence, finder of the coin could expect a year of good luck, or at least a polite round of applause and a visit to Mr. Thornton, the village apothecary. In all this gently fraying formality, there was a softness, a slowness that modern Decembers sometimes forget. Time moved like treacle in the Edwardian drawing room. Chatter gave way to the quiet thud of logs in the fireplace, the distant pop of crackers pulled too late, and perhaps, if one listened closely, the sound of a great uncle pretending not to open his hip flask during the Queen's Christmas message. Though in 1905 it would have been King Edward VII, and he preferred cigars and long walks with his dogs. The Christmas message wouldn't arrive until 1932, leaving plenty of time for sneakier sips. As the hours passed and the day leaned quietly into itself, the drawing room grew sleepier, warmer, filled with the haze of tinsel light and turkey-induced tranquility. Somewhere, faintly but distinctly, the sound of someone tuning a string instrument echoed from the parlor, a prelude perhaps to something a touch more musical. In the chill of a December evening in 1905, the fog crept through the gaslit streets of London like a well-mannered ghost, the type that knew how to mind its own business and never slammed doors. By now, the Edwardian Christmas machine was in full steam, quite literally, if you were within sniffing distance of a pudding boiler. Yet beyond the plum puddings, goose fat, and the suspicious abundance of holly, there was one Christmas tradition that everyone, highborn or humble, could agree upon: the unmistakable sound of the Christmas carol. Now, Edwardians didn't invent caroling, of course. That honour belongs to medieval monks with a gift for rhyming in Latin and loitering outside taverns in woolen robes. But by 1905, caroling was considered not only respectable, but profoundly seasonable. You could find carolers on virtually every corner, bundled in scarves and thick gloves, wielding hymn sheets like holy scrolls, harmonizing their way toward a respectable collection tin. Victorian moralists, some of whom still lingered disapprovingly into the Edwardian era, like uninvited aunts at a late supper, had tamed the wilder Yuletide songs into more appropriate fare. Out went the rowdy folk ballads about wassailing and mild intoxication. In came Once in Royal David's City, a hymn so reverent it practically curtsied. In country villages, though, the wilder carols occasionally survived, thanks to amateur choirs who may or may not have rehearsed. Some were made up of local farmhands and shopkeepers who knew just enough verses to suggest they'd practiced, yet not enough to avoid drifting into mysteriously improvised fourth and fifth verses. These were occasions less of spiritual communion and more of warm breath hitting cold air, while stern matrons handed out clementines and kept an eye on Mr. Potts, who always sang a half-beat behind. Meanwhile, for those of the upper crust who would no sooner sing in the street than wear a second-day cravat, the musical rituals were moved indoors. Drawing-room recitals flourished. Picture a walnut-furnished salon. Wallpaper flocked enough to give moths homes of their own. A nervous niece might be prodded toward the piano with the gentle menace of a sherry-sipping dowager suggesting, "Do play that nice one about the heralding angels, darling." These tightly choreographed performances were part concert, part examination, and wholly unpredictable. The piano was often mildly out of tune, a natural phenomenon caused presumably by the cold air and years of being played exclusively during Christmas and Aunt Geraldine's birthday. The applause afterward was as ritualized as the applause at a royal command performance, never too enthusiastic, lest it imply surprise. In towns and cities, however, carolers roamed the streets with admirable stamina. Groups ranging from children on the hunt for halfpennies to organised church choirs stomped their way up and down residential lanes, stopping under well-lit windows to serenade respectable households with Good King Wenceslas, a song which, despite centuries of repetition, still caused confusion around the phrase when the snow lay round about deep and crisp and even. This line alone caused a generation of Edwardians to mistakenly believe snow had its own classification system. Carolers often carried lanterns, ostensibly to read their music, but more reliably, to illuminate uneven paving stones and avoid unwanted tumbles into rose bushes. Their footwear was hardy, leather boots with buckles or lace to the ankle, and their cheeks, a healthy hue thanks to temperatures that hovered just above bracing. For the carolers, it wasn't just about the music, it was also about the promise of treats. Some households engaged in pleasant bribery, handing out roasted chestnuts or small coins. Others maintained a more frugal approach, offering warm smiles and brisk closes of the window. But the spirit of the season endured. Even the coppers on patrol, whose job it was to ensure that no revelry turned too raucous, found themselves momentarily still as a chorus of schoolboys managed a particularly moving silent night. One constable in Paddington was so touched, he allegedly offered a boiled sweet and a compliment on pitch, an act of generosity that was noted in the choir logbook, with a faint awe usually reserved for scripture. And so, from manor house to milk stand, from the frost-dusted steps of Buckinghamshire villages to the soot-crowned rooftops of Manchester, the sounds of Edwardian Christmas carried far and wide. Music forged a quiet unity among the classes that no political speech ever could. All voices lost briefly in the same chilly air, the harmonies rising as one before drifting off toward chimney smoke and stars. As the wind slipped past gables and tea-cozied kettles began their evening song, another tradition quietly tugged at the season's sleeve. Stockings hung not out of necessity, but out of hope. And the peculiar 1905 belief that oranges were the height of luxury. Twilight settled over the English countryside like a well-loved woolen shawl, with the air just cold enough to pinch cheeks and encourage hands into pockets by default. In the drawing rooms of 1905 Edwardian homes, something charmingly inevitable was occurring. No, not an impromptu scandal or a fainting governess, although those were always lurking. Rather, the scent of oranges pierced the crispness of December, and that could only mean one thing. Pomanders. Yes, dear listener, the humble orange, made festive with a generous stabbing of cloves. Edwardians were nothing if not politely enthusiastic in their holiday crafting. Kitchens became chambers of aromatic ambition. Children, cheeks ruddy from outdoor play or a mild scolding, gathered around tables to prove they could impale citrus with fragrant precision. If the end result looked a bit like a fruity pincushion of dubious intent, well, no one said Edwardian crafts were elegant, only earnest. These pomanders were then strung with ribbons or tucked into bureau drawers to ward off evil, which in 1905 included moths, melancholia, and the cousin who played the spoons at family dinners. But the real unsung hero of the Edwardian holiday household, the butler, no doubt a Reginald or a Morris, trained to glide silently from parlour to pantry, offering tea, brandy, or depending on familial tension levels, both at once. Christmas time doubled the pressure. Mistletoe arrangements to supervise, wine inventories to maintain, and the impossible task of ensuring the Christmas pudding was steamed, flamed, and unburnt, ideally all on time. Now, the pudding itself was an edible achievement of Victorian hangover and Edwardian bravado. Weeks in the making, age was meant to improve it. Much like Edwardian spinsters or left-handed bowls players. Sweat, spices, and a scandalous amount of alcohol were folded together into a dense, glossy orb, then cloistered away to mature patiently in a cool larder, or, if you were slightly eccentric, the airing cupboard above the hot water tank. Families would gather around its unveiling as though it were a royal infant. eyes gleaming as mother or cook, or let's face it, cook under mother's supervision, doused the pudding in brandy and struck a match. A sudden blue flame would dance on the surface, respectable aunts clutching their pearls, uncles leaning in closer, hoping for both spectacle and a second helping. Coins were stuffed inside the pudding for luck. If you bit down on a silver sixpence, it meant good fortune and dental fees. Sometimes buttons were added too, though with less clarity about their magical properties. It may have been a subtle Edwardian nudge toward finding a tailor, or perhaps simply to remind one that life is occasionally chewy and confusing. Meanwhile, somewhere in the drawing room, another object of curious importance stood: the Christmas card garland. By 1905, sending holiday cards had become a national sport. One was expected to send and receive dozens. The more cards pinned across the mantelpiece, the more socially successful the household. Distant cousins, long-forgotten schoolmates, even that one neighbour who mistook you for someone else at a village fete. All were fair game for a quietly competitive Christmas card. And let's not forget the card imagery. Angels, holly, and snow-draped thatched cottages were staples. But if one looked closer, 1905 also indulged a flair for the bizarre. A cat playing a cello, frogs ice skating in waistcoats, or cherubs piloting turnip-shaped air balloons. Whether due to artistic whimsy or Victorian leftovers, no one questioned it too deeply. After all, the postman was working overtime. Best not to upset him with terrible taste or an ill-tempered dog. The hearth glowed with a steady crackle, stockings now starting to appear along mantels, carefully stitched and utterly empty, for now. Fireguards shimmered with brass polish, a silent testimony to parental worries over sparks, ashes, and the tendency of small children to poke interesting things into flames. Outside, frost etched poetic nonsense onto glass panes, turning windows into galleries of winter lace. The occasional shuffle of boots on gravel signalled guests departing after a thoroughly acceptable evening of parlor games, perhaps cleverly dodging the dreaded game of forfeits, in which one might have had to sing, dance, or recite a riddle while wearing a chamber pot on their head. Edwardian revelry, as ever, balanced refinement with barely constrained anarchy. Inside, the final lamps were turned low. Cats folded themselves into loaves near grates. Grandfather clocks offered an approving tick. And somewhere in the settled quiet, a pomander, dry and silently muffled in spice, gently offered up its citrusy ghost to the air. And just beyond the stillness, where the scent of cloves drifts into dreams, the stage was being quietly set. For music, proper caroling, boots on cobbles, cold noses, and harmonies wobbling somewhere between sacred and slightly tipsy. Back in December of 1905, a respectable Edwardian kitchen was equal parts culinary factory and controlled chaos. As snow lazily dozed on hedgerows and railway sidings, the true chaos inside was not political nor romantic, but culinary. The long and noble tradition of Christmas pudding making had begun. Picture the scullery, warm, steamy, somehow perpetually damp even at low humidity. A maid in a stiff white apron busily chopped suet with the resigned air of someone who knew precisely what fate awaited her fingernails. Not because she was psychic, but because she'd done this last year, and the year before that. The Christmas pudding, of course, was not meant to be moist and inviting like today's desserts. It was supposed to be dark, firm, and spiritually Victorian. A dense orb of currenty ambition, boiled into softness over roughly the same length of time it would take to read Anna Karenina aloud, by the fire, in Russian. Making the pudding was more than a recipe. It was an annual ritual somewhere between a séance and a group confession. The ingredients included flour, breadcrumbs, eggs, suet, sugar, raisins, sultanas, candied peel, nutmeg, cinnamon, and the hopes of the entire household suspended in a brandy fog. Every family member, from the toddling to the tottering, had to give the pudding a stir and make a wish while doing so. Now, whether the wish came true was never empirically charted, but the stirring portion was non-negotiable. Even stoic great-uncle Humphrey would lean in with his solemn white moustache and give the bowl a ceremonial swirl, typically while someone shouted clockwise, as if the fate of the empire depended on it. And perhaps in the pudding, on some spiritual level, it did. Pudding Day was not chosen at random. It traditionally fell on what the Victorians had christened Stir Up Sunday, the last Sunday before Advent, although in practice it often happened whenever the cook found the courage. The stirrings were accompanied by arguments over coins, specifically whether to embed them in the pudding. Silver sixpences were traditional, and chewing on one in January could be considered lucky, depending mostly on whether you kept your teeth. Then came the question of presentation. This was not a dessert you simply served. It needed entrance, much like a nobleman. At the Edwardian table, the pudding was brought forth with great pomp, doused in brandy, lit spectacularly, and served with a mixture of brandy butter and applause. Portraits of the late Queen Victoria gazed approvingly from the walls, or so one liked to imagine. And as people devoured spheres of dried fruit optimism, they tried very hard not to admit that they slightly preferred the trifle. Meanwhile, the kitchens were also looking to other festive fare. Goose was still the bird of choice for many a family, although the turkey was beginning its slow and plump rise to household domination. Geese were soaked, stuffed, and roasted until the kitchen smelled like a Dickensian dream. For the upper crust, the table groaned under the weight of game pies, oysters, Yorkshire ham, and anything else that could strut festive opulence. In contrast, the family down the lane might settle for a roast chicken dressed in hope, with side dishes padded out with potato ingenuity. Regardless of income, the Edwardian Christmas dinner was always an ambitious affair, prepared over days, eaten in hours, and remembered with a hazy fondness attributed largely to brandy. Not all the magic, though, belonged to the meals. There was a special serenity in the act of preparation itself. Households bustling like tiny orchestras tuning up for the main event. Brass polish was summoned from high shelves. Linen napkins emerged from forgotten drawers. Children were temporarily bribed with buttered toast to keep them from prematurely mauling the mince pies. Everyone had their role, be it stirring, stuffing, slicing, or supervising. And even the cat was somehow part of it, sitting imperiously by the oven as though spiritually connected to the roast. Above it all lingered the sweet, spiced perfume of clove, orange peel, and cinnamon. Pans clinked, saucepans sighed, and through it all drifted the possibility that something slightly burned, but no one wanted to admit it because it smelled reassuringly like Christmas. And so, in the glow of firelight that made the brass glint and the curtains glow, the Edwardian household continued its quiet alchemy, transforming humble ingredients into holiday indulgence and ordinary rooms into stage sets for memory. Outside, snow kept falling in a patient hush, as if the sky itself had grown contemplative. Inside, preparations poured steadily onward, until, in another room, the notes of an old carol were struck, a quiet, ghost-like melody travelling through the halls, summoning attention like the aroma of cloves. They were arriving, the musicians, or so someone whispered. But that is a tale unto itself. In the quiet Edwardian December of 1905, as fog curled around lampposts like shy cats and the gaslights flickered with theatrical uncertainty, there was another seasonal tradition that crept gently into homes. The Christmassy card. Ah yes, the Christmas card. That small rectangle of cheer and Victorian gilt, sent mostly to reassure acquaintances that one was still alive and at least semi-literate. A century ago, the exchange of cards had blossomed into a minor national obsession, thanks in part to improvements in cheap colour printing and the fact that no one had Facebook to passively ignore people on. In 1905, you sent a card if you cared, and you received 37 more than you wanted in return. The cards themselves were miniature masterpieces of the mildly bewildering. Some featured robins dressed like men, others turnips wearing bonnets. Occasionally, frogs danced with umbrellas, or small children smiled serenely beside improbably large porridge pots. Seasonally appropriate, dubiously so, entirely charming. Absolutely. The Edwardians didn't restrict themselves to candy canes and Santa Claus. Remember, this was still Britain, where humour was best served with a raised brow and a vague sense of panic. For every heartfelt season's greetings, there was an image of a turkey chasing a small boy, possibly a warning, possibly a metaphor. Or cats having tea, which was frankly more of a year-round fantasy than a holiday-specific one. Sir Henry Cole, the man credited with popularising the Christmas card decades earlier, had likely not anticipated that his invention would blossom into an industry where one could find messages like "May your Yuletide be moist with merriment," delicately scrawled beneath a snowman playing the accordion. Yet by 1905, the mania was in full swing. And really, it made sense. Picture a home in Surrey or Sussex, its fireplace crackling with the restrained enthusiasm of coal. Snow might be falling, just enough to make going out treacherous and staying in noble. The family gathers. Aunt Millicent with her endless embroidery, father behind the times, barely glancing up unless something in the financial columns sneezes. Meanwhile, young Edith or James sits by the front hall table examining the recent post, a stack of creamy envelopes, each brimming with seasonal goodwill and occasional confusion. Young Edmund has sent a card again, says Mother, adjusting her pince-nez. It features a fox in spectacles roasting chestnuts. How quaint, says Father, without looking up. It's eating the chestnuts, adds Edith, and possibly the child next to them. Some cards were homemade, a feat that ranged from delightful to alarming. Children would sometimes glue bits of lace, ribbon, and errant feathers from the parlour canary to a piece of cardboard, scrawl "Happy Christmas" in ungoverned ink, and present it with great ceremony. "Oh, darling," said the average Edwardian mother, perfectly composed, even as half of her best upholstery seemed missing. It's really something. But make no mistake, sending cards was no slapdash affair. The Royal Mail system in Edwardian England was a marvel of promptness. At major cities, there were up to 10 deliveries a day. That's correct, 10. You could post a Christmas card in the morning and it might still arrive in time for tea. Frankly, it was faster than some emails are today, and infinitely more charming. The sheer logistics of it all baffled the minds of small children and made postal workers both sainted and slightly panicked. They juggled sacks of handwritten missives with the gravitas of holiday gladiators, navigating icy footpaths while remembering not to trample over the gamely shoveled stoops of overly proud homeowners. By mid-December, mantelpieces were transformed into card battlegrounds. Who had the most? Whose were the prettiest? who, most importantly, had received one from Lady Dewhurst instead of just her housekeeper. These were social metrics of immense gravity, the Edwardian equivalent of Twitter likes, but with deckled edges. The designs, of course, varied not only by whimsy, but by geography. For the well-travelled family, perhaps a card from overseas, displaying a sleepy European chapel under violet skies, or a Mediterranean angel looking inexplicably like someone named Giorgio. For the thoroughly British, perhaps a scene from the Lake District, glinting under impossible snowdrifts, where sheep looked both frozen and deeply philosophical. And quietly, as these charming oddities stood proudly atop pianos and bookshelves, they changed the tone of winter evenings. Guests entered with scarf-flung flourish, spotted the card with the singing hedgehog, and conversations began. About art, about memory, about who had the audacity to send an unsigned card last year. The Edwardian Christmas card was not simply decoration. It was a quiet way of reaching across distance and soot-smudged December fog to say, "I'm still here. I remembered you." Even if that memory showed up in the form of two geese ice skating with human shoes. And so, with parlour clocks ticking gently and the scent of wax and pine settling into carpets, the card season continued. A reminder that connection, no matter how gloriously odd the vessel, was forever part of the holiday ritual. And just beyond those hushed rooms and robin-adorned stationery, another tradition stirred in the Edwardian night, one that was far louder and far stickier. On a soft December morning in 1905, the baker's boy slipped along Kensington High Street with fog clinging to his woolen cap and a grin thawing through the cold. The world was wrapped in a pre-Christmas hush, the kind of hush that made one expect either snowfall or scandal at any moment. And somewhere between these twin possibilities lay a third, quieter tradition: pudding stirring. It's easy now, from the safety of our central heating, to overlook the spiritual weight of the Christmas pudding. But back then, this dense and slightly threatening dessert was more than a culinary undertaking. It was a family ritual veering on the mystical. The household gathered, grave as tiny parliamentarians, around a porcelain basin big enough to smuggle a goose in. This was Stir-Up Sunday, not an invented holiday or social media trend, but a real service marked in the Anglican calendar, the last Sunday before Advent, and a practical reminder to begin your puddings before it was suddenly too late and the guests were already sipping sherry in the drawing room in mid-December. Even those who only touch flour under duress would step forward for their ceremonial stir. With wooden spoon in hand, each person would turn clockwise, very important. Counterclockwise risked all sorts of spiritual and possibly digestive disasters. Close their eyes and make a wish. It was a curious mix of faith and flour, a prayer conducted over sweat and raisins. The Edwardians loved symbolism, preferably edible and ideally soaked in alcohol. The pudding was a sacred archive of agrarian pride and imperial flair. Plums, dates, nuts, peel. The whole empire distilled into dessert. An ambitious matron might prepare the pudding with 13 ingredients, symbolizing Christ and the 12 apostles. It was never politely questioned why Jesus might be represented by shredded beef fat. But symbolism isn't required to make obvious sense, only to feel ancient and vaguely impressive. Some cooks, bold as December robins, would bury charms in the batter: a sixpence for wealth, a thimble for singlehood, a button for bachelorhood, and, in some tragic cases, nothing at all for the unlucky stirrer, who perhaps stirred a fraction too counterclockwise. And all the while, In a quiet parlor somewhere, a fire would pop quietly behind brass fenders, and someone's aunt would narrate the pudding's provenance for the 7th time that morning. The Edwardian era was rich with pride of place and pudding. Both required regular tending and occasional bouts of gentle denial. Of course, it's lighter than grandmother's, one might say, struggling to lift the dish with both arms. She never did know how to properly scold her sweet. Meanwhile, upstairs, the piano was opened, and a delicate version of O Come All Ye Faithful threaded its way through the wood-panelled halls, possibly played by a daughter who'd spent 6 winters anguishing over scales just to perform respectably during Christmas tea. The only audience was the cat, seated on a crocheted footstool with all the solemnity of an unwilling bishop. But Edwardian households, even in pudding season, weren't all grand pianos and fine linens. Down the street, in closer quarters warmed by a single fire and shared socks, simpler puddings were stirred too, the raisins fewer, the wishes just as tightly held. A child might trade in his turn at the bowl for an extra finger swipe of treacle. A grandmother might murmur a wish that simply said, "Let them stay healthy this year." And still, the ritual carried on, from manor house to modest kitchen, mixing centuries of tradition into one wobbly brown conclusion. By noon, the pudding was tightly wrapped in muslin, not unlike a baby being sent to a very confusing nativity, then tied with string and steamed within an inch of its life. The scent floated up like a memory, burnt sugar, spice, something faintly biblical, and when it was eventually cooled, it was tucked away in a cool pantry to rest. Yes, the pudding, once prepared, had to mature. It needed time to think things over. Like a teenager sent to boarding school, the tradition held that the longer the pudding aged, the deeper its flavour. And so, in kitchens all across Edwardian England, puddings now sat in cold cupboards, aging with more dignity than some elderly relatives. And so, in the glow of firelight and a house thrumming with expectation, one might hear a whispered sigh, not from a child nor a cat, but from the great brass pot, as if proud of its pudding, now resting and respectable. Beyond the pantry door, however, there was still much to be readied. For next came the greenery, the holly, and the furious art of decorative restraint. Outside, a soft frost misted over the hedgerows, like icing sugar shaken by an absent-minded pastry chef. In kitchens all across Edwardian England, hands were busy, rolling dough, flour dusted, and blissfully unaware of the century to come. It smelled of nutmeg, oranges, and the kind of cinnamon that makes a person sit down without knowing why. The Christmas kitchen of 1905, you see, wasn't just a place of cooking. Oh no, it was a stage upon which the unglamorous heroes of Yuletide toiled. The cooks, maids, and those clever aunties who somehow knew 20 recipes and how to keep a fire going with a damp coal scuttle. Every respectable home, from modest cottage to manor house, had some sort of festive preparation underway by mid-December. Even those who could only manage an orange and a hopeful potato would infuse the day with ritual. But for those lucky enough to have a kitchen full of supplies, and perhaps a cook with forearms like mythology, the culinary traditions of a proper Edwardian Christmas were nothing short of a seasonal symphony. Now imagine this scene, an enormous copper pot burbling dangerously on the stove. It contains Christmas pudding, which in 1905 was a universe unto itself. This wasn't a dainty dessert. This was a black hole of fruit, suet, and brandy. Making one involved roughly 1,000 ingredients, a week of planning, and the nervous hope no one would chip a tooth on the sixpence hidden inside. Even the process of steaming the pudding was a gentle kind of warfare. It was wrapped tightly in cloth, tied like a pirate's purse, and left to bubble for 7 to 10 years, or possibly just 8 hours, depending on whose aunt you asked. There was no such thing as overcooked. The longer it steamed, the more the pudding fulfilled its destiny of becoming digestively challenging. This was regarded as a strength. Properly sturdy, someone might mutter approvingly at its brick-like consistency, while sipping sherry from a glass that only cracked slightly. Mince pies rolled next into view, sweet, spiced and filled with Victorian-era optimism and suet. They bore little resemblance to modern versions. Back then, they still held echoes of the medieval meat pies they descended from. Yes, they were once truly meaty. By 1905, the meat had mostly disappeared, replaced by apples, currants, and a misguided sense of health. These pies were to be eaten with reckless abandon, one a night from Christmas until 12th night, if you were properly committed. A superstition said eating 12 would guarantee good luck, although a baker's dozen might grant gastrointestinal time travel. Let us not overlook the rather theatrical arrival of the roast goose. Turkey was gaining popularity by that time, thanks to its aristocratic image and the enthusiastic endorsements from Queen Victoria's earlier Christmases. But goose remained beloved, especially among the middle class and those whose stomachs had already signed a peace treaty in preparation. It was crisped golden, often stuffed with sage and onion, and basted so frequently it might have started to feel flattered. The smell, the comforting perfume of roasting fat and herbs, was practically a lullaby of its own. Meanwhile, the scullery maid, that underappreciated sprite of the Edwardian household, was probably elbow deep in the mountain range of washing up. No dishwashers in sight. Simply scalding water, chips of lye soap, and a level of patience known only to saints and people who've tried bathing cats. And if one were particularly observant, one might spot grandmother in the corner, peeling chestnuts with a small knife and a thwarted sense of melancholy. After all, peeling chestnuts by hand is traditional in the way root canal is traditional, best remembered fondly from a distance. And amidst this flurry of furious festivity, there bloomed another tradition, perhaps the most quietly cherished of all, the midnight nibble. Late at night, while the grates glowed low and the candles guttered tiredly, there might be a stealthy slice of pie snuck from under a dishcloth, or a leftover sausage rolled up in innocent-looking bread. A solitary ritual taken barefoot and silent, perhaps under the solemn gaze of a cuckoo clock waiting to strike 2. Food, you see, in Edwardian England, was more than just sustenance. It was memory, legacy, superstition and love, served on a platter and garnished with sprigs of holly and the occasional elbow grease. The holiday spirit resided as much in these warm kitchens as it did in church pews or parlor songs. A Christmas pudding cracking under its own weight, a roast goose purring gently in its juices. These were the moments that made the winter glow. And as dawn threatened to nudge at the frost-rimmed windows, another part of the celebration awaited, one that began not in the kitchen, but just down the passage, where pine boughs were being strung above doorways and something faint, something musical, drifted in the still air. Snow had a rather theatrical sense of timing in Edwardian England. It often arrived just when people had finished complaining that winter didn't feel quite Christmassy enough. And then, right on cue, it would glide in softly, painting chimneys white and muffling horse hooves on cobblestones, as if the world had tucked itself under a heavy down blanket. In December of 1905, London saw just such a dignified snowfall, a sort that made even the most committed city dwellers feel like woodland creatures in sweaters. It was in this whitewashed setting that a quiet, curious transformation was occurring, just beneath the holly wreaths and frosted windows. The unexpected rise of the Edwardian Christmas postcard. Before your relatives were subjecting you to glittered reindeer and emboldened claims of festive cheer, there was an era where sending someone a Christmas greeting involved a toe-curlingly polite turn of phrase, and sometimes, for reasons no one has fully explained, a picture of a turnip. Postcards had been on the rise since the 1870s, and by 1905, they were the social media of their time. Quick, cheap to send, just a halfpenny stamp, and requiring no tedious envelope licking. In an age before texting was invented to express thinking of you in the form of a penguin emoji, the Edwardians opted for elaborately illustrated cardboard rectangles. And at Christmas time, those rectangles all but flew through the Royal Mail like tiny sleighs with premature ambition. Now, if you're imagining these cards as scenes of snowy lanes with rosy-cheeked children and politely plump robins, well, sometimes. But the Edwardians had a vivid imagination, and by vivid, we mean occasionally unhinged. Some cards were indeed charming. Choirs by gaslight, candlelit parlors, ice skaters in ankle-length wool, the kind of scenes that make you want to fall asleep in a teapot. But mixed among them were some truly perplexing choices. Frogs playing violins, cats dressed as choir boys, and a remarkable number of anthropomorphic vegetables acting suspiciously festive. One popular card from the holiday season of 1905 depicts a potato couple in formal wear. Yes, their eyes are potato eyes, clinking champagne glasses beneath mistletoe. There were hedgehogs roasting chestnuts, pigs delivering parcels, a giddy cherub riding a turkey side saddle. It remains unclear whether these images were meant to inspire joy or mild existential dread, but people loved them. Postal workers reportedly moved 11.5 million cards on Christmas Eve alone. That's more than 11 million tiny, glitterless Instagram updates, all wrapped in ink and imagination. Much of this Yuletide whimsy came from the continent. German illustrators, in particular, played a formidable role in supplying bizarre and beautiful images to printers in Britain. Raphael Tuck and Sons, the unofficial kings of quirky Edwardian postcards, commissioned artists from across Europe to contribute to what became known, quite literally, as the Christmas Rush. They even held postcard design contests with prizes and national acclaim, which seems even more charming when you remember they didn't have Photoshop and had to draw every single porcupine by hand. But postcards weren't just about surprise amphibians and Victorian pomposity. They were functional too. With the second daily post delivery, yes, a second delivery, as if by magic owls, one could send a card in the morning and expect a reply that same afternoon. Christmas greetings felt immediate and slightly thrilling. It was a season of deliberate connection wrapped in stamps and scribbles. In parlors warmed by coal fires and lined with family portraits wearing identical expressions, Christmas cards were clipped onto strings or stuck into the mirror frame above the fireplace. They fluttered gently in the draft whenever someone passed. Daily proof that someone out there was thinking of you. Well, you and a turnip in a bonnet. Though the whimsical tendencies of Edwardian Christmas cards have waned somewhat, the tradition lingers in its own adapted form, now printed with glitter that gets everywhere and messages from people you haven't seen since rationing was a thing. And so, in warm houses smelling of plum pudding and stale coal smoke, the people of 1905 admired their postcard menageries, grateful for the invention of colour printing, and deeply confused by Santa's sudden partnership with a family of singing onions. It was a curious tradition, this postcard phenomenon. Light-hearted, imaginative, and occasionally unsettling. But more than anything, it was a sign, one sent with affection and just a hint of whimsy, that someone, somewhere, had paused for a moment and thought of you. Outside, the snow continued falling, steady, silent, and utterly indifferent to pigs in scarves. Now, let's peek in on what was bubbling in the Edwardian kitchen, a place where plum pudding steamed, spice tins clattered, and culinary expectations could be defeated by something as simple as a goose with opinions. Far from the crackle of polished parlor fires and the polite clink of sherry glasses on silver trays, the Edwardian season held one other curious ritual, often forgotten as it nestled amidst carols and cranberry sauce: the Yuletide post. Yes, the Christmas card. That humble, rectangular token of Victorian invention had, by 1905, evolved from a novelty into a full-blown cultural obligation. One could argue, quietly, and at a respectable distance, that nothing said peace on earth in the Edwardian household quite like the thundering arrival of 6 dozen cards from people you'd met once at a railway platform. Every December, the Royal Mail flurried with such activity, it could have been mistaken for a snowstorm of paper. In fact, in the week before Christmas in 1905, over 11 million letters and cards passed through London alone. It was a bureaucratic blizzard managed expertly by an army of postal workers who, despite having to trudge through fog, sleet, and that unmistakably British form of sideways rain, managed to deliver most missives with shocking speed and almost Victorian smugness. The postmen, or rather, postpersons, for the number of women employed in the Royal Mail, had surged by this point, became as familiar in some rural villages as the vicar or the baker. And during Yuletide, they were practically folk heroes. Small children would race to greet them each morning, hoping for a card from an aunt in Brighton, or, better yet, a halfpenny stamp they could peel off and add to a slowly growing collection. These cards were a curious bunch. Edwardian sensibilities teetered between the sentimental and the surreal. While modern eyes are trained to expect snow-flocked fir trees and jolly Santas, the cards of 1905 were just as likely to feature frogs dancing in waistcoats, humanoid onions exchanging gifts, or somber robins perched on inexplicably stern branches. One card, preserved in an archive, features a cat playing a mandolin while a pig toasts the new year, perhaps a subtle commentary on Edwardian optimism, or simply a printer's fever dream. It was a quieter kind of joy, receiving these cards. The rustle of heavy cardstock, the smell of ink, the looping penmanship that often ran diagonally across the page in a sort of enthusiastic slalom. One could gauge the emotional investment of the sender by the length of the inscription. A terse "best" might indicate a forgotten cousin, while "may your hearth be warm and your puddings rise" from Auntie Marjorie was as good as a warm hug and a sixpence. Sending the cards was another matter entirely. Families would gather around the writing desk, or, in more casual households, a kitchen table strewn with biscuit crumbs and ink smudges. Father, wearing spectacles balanced tremulously near the tip of his nose, would consult the address book with the air of a general reviewing battlefield maps. Names would be ticked off with solemn importance, and slight debates would erupt over whether the Thompsons of Tunbridge Wells truly merited a second-year card without having yet reciprocated. The sheer volume of correspondence sometimes led to what could only be described as Yuletide fatigue, a condition characterized by cramped hands, dwindling ink, and that creeping sensation that one had accidentally duplicated their seasonal sentiments to Aunt Edith and the milkman, verbatim. Still, the act mattered. it was more than etiquette. These cards knitted people together across townships and train timetables, threading connection through the chilly days of December. Particularly in the Edwardian era, a time of restrained emotion and immaculately buttoned waistcoats, a painted robin and a curly, merry Christmas allowed people, ever so cautiously, to claim warmth. To say, in carefully inked cursive, "I remembered you." And so, mantelpieces bloomed with them, hung from strings with miniature pegs, propped between clocks and candlesticks, or arrayed around a lamp like a paper halo. Visitors would glance over them approvingly, perhaps pretending not to spot their own card, strategically placed near the top for maximum visibility. As dusk pressed around those Edwardian homes and the gaslights flickered into their evening shimmer, families would sit and quietly admire this seasonal paper garden, quite possibly with a glass of port and a mince pie the size of an ambitious hamster. Outside, in the ever-thickening air of a late December evening, a silhouette passed, a postman, thin in frame but mighty in task, trudging onward with another day's delivery of greetings, robins, and festive livestock in bowler hats. What his bag carried next, however, was not just post. No, nestled under those cards was another seasonal miracle altogether, the Edwardian gift exchange. Less glitter, more hand-knit surprises. But that, as fate would have it, was soon to unfold. Evening had drifted down like an embroidered curtain over the Edwardian countryside, stitched with smoke from chimney pots and the dim flicker of mantle flames. In the year 1905, December's nights came early and stayed long, stretching out like a contented cat before a parlor fire. And while carols warmed the air and puddings steamed patiently on stoves, there was one crucial evening ritual threading its way through many a respectable household: the rousing redistribution of envelopes, holly-trimmed and ominously stiff, the giving and receiving of Christmas cards. Now, the Edwardians did not invent the Christmas card. No, that honour belongs to the earlier Victorians who, apparently, found time to revolutionize both postal systems and sentimental art simultaneously. But by 1905, the tradition had become a firmly rooted part of the festive season. So much so that households were assessed, if not judged, by the quantity and quality of their card displays. Mantelpieces groaned under them. Sideboards showed them off like antique silver. Even the piano, that great bastion of politely endured sing-alongs, was often festooned with a flurry of illustrated affection. Sending Christmas cards in Edwardian England was not a simple matter of popping down to the corner shop. It was an entire operation, particularly for the middle and upper classes who, being genteel and British, enjoyed nothing more than expressing warmth and affection from a respectable emotional distance. The cards themselves were glorious affairs, gaudily gilded, hand-tinted, with tragically sincere angels, bucolic snow scenes, and occasionally alarming children dressed as snowflakes. The designs walked a curious line between charming and faintly menacing. One could, quite genuinely, receive a card featuring a frog riding a pig through a snowstorm, with the words, "To wish you Christmas glee," penned in curling script. Artistic standards were variable, but the real drama wasn't in the receiving. It was in the sending. The household's lady, armed with her annual address book, an alarming number of postage stamps, and perhaps fortified with a sherry, would begin the serious business of writing out each card by hand. Names were checked, social standings assessed, herrings were occasionally read, and there was always the lurking fear. Had Miss Templecroft at number 9 sent one last year? Better send one this year, just in case. But what if she doesn't send one back? This, dear listener, was the polite chaos of Edwardian reciprocity. To manage the deluge, the Royal Mail mounted a postal offensive of admirable efficiency. Temporary workers were hired. Postboxes were emptied several times daily. In urban areas, one could post a card in the morning and have it arrive the same evening, a feat which practically screams black magic to the modern eye. And the postman, that undersung hero in a brass-buttoned coat and positively shimmering moustache, became a welcome guest for a few blissful days. It wasn't uncommon to tip him with a warm mince pie or a dram of something disguised as tonic. That, or receive a card back from him, simply addressed, "To the kind lady on the corner with the cat and the peonies." And where did all these cards go, once delivered? There were systems. Aristocrats with staff might have a designated footman arrange them in symmetrical spirals around mirrors. Middle-class families tended toward linear mantle displays or fashionably asymmetrical groupings on side tables, and the more enthusiastic decorators would string them across the room, pegged onto red ribbons so that you could be publicly reminded who remembered you every time you crossed the drawing room. Children, of course, found their own amusement in the tradition. Some delighted in counting how many cards the family received, treating it as a bloodless popularity contest. Others repurposed the prettiest cards into paper dolls or secret messages, folding them into wobbling sedans for toy mice or reimagining snow-laden cottages as bookmarks for half-read schoolbooks. A good card could be many things when the grown-ups weren't watching. But beyond the glitter and the odd, unsettling cherub, Christmas cards held a quiet kind of magic. Each one represented a thread, a connection reaching across town, county, or occasionally even across oceans. In the hush of a candlelit room, with lamplight catching on golden inks and cursive messages, there was a sense that the thrum of the season reached far beyond one's own hearth. People's hearts whispered across distances, just loudly enough to be caught in pen and postmark. So while outside the world descended into frost and lamps glowed soft through snow-dusted panes, thousands of small gestures of recognition passed, through hands into homes, and there they stayed, propped upon mantels, nesting near clocks, modest, merry witnesses to the season. Just as the last card found its place beside a rather overfed robin in a red waistcoat, the dining room door creaked open, and the unmistakable scent of cinnamon, citrus, and cloves came wafting out. Ah yes, the Edwardian spice cupboard was about to take centre stage. By the time the clock struck 4:30 on Christmas Eve, the golden dusk of a proper Edwardian afternoon had settled neatly upon the rooftops of every soot-sprinkled chimney in the town. In 1905, the sun knew its place, ducking off the stage with a genteel bow, just as the lamps were being lit and the kettle began to mutter its evening soliloquy. Inside the homes of polite British society, especially those nestled in red-bricked rows with lace curtains poised like theatre drapes, there bloomed a quiet sort of mayhem. The trimming of the pudding. You see, the Christmas pudding, which might look suspiciously like a cannonball in a festive hat, wasn't just dessert. It was an edible calendar, a relic of yearly rituals, and, if one wasn't careful, a dental emergency. Earlier in the Advent season, households had boiled the pudding into near geological firmness, then stored it lovingly for weeks to mature, as if preparing it for a university entrance exam. And now, on the eve of its grand performance, it was time for redressing. It would be carefully steamed back to civility, garnished reverently with a sprig of holly, and doused in brandy, because nothing screams "Happy Birthday, Jesus" quite like pyromania at the dinner table. Much of Edwardian culinary tradition walked a curious line between elegance and culinary daredevilry. There was a fascination, for example, with adding sweat into anything that didn't move fast enough. Fruitcakes, puddings, and pastries would all find themselves lovingly larded, perhaps to ensure they could withstand harsh Edwardian winters or prolonged theological debate. Meanwhile, in finer drawing rooms, the business of Christmas crackers was underway. These weren't the edible kind, at least not if you valued your molars, but rather brightly wrapped paper tubes filled with tiny prizes, explosive enthusiasm, and hats shaped like leaking origami. Invented in the Victorian era by Tom Smith, a confectioner with more ambition than sense, crackers had by 1905 become indispensable to the Edwardian Christmas tableau. Guests would ceremoniously pull the paper ends with a sharp bang, unleashing a tiny paper crown, a bad joke about parsnips, and perhaps a metal thimble, because everyone needs reminding of their mending responsibilities over roast goose. Of course, not all was merriment and mottled fruitcake. For the servants, the unsung heroes of 100 plum pudding miracles, Christmas Eve was less mystical and more logistical. A Downton of ducking bells and endless trays, where boots needed polishing, guests needed settling, and figgy puddings needed not to explode. And yet, even downstairs, there might be caroling, a warmed sherry, and a stolen moment staring out the scullery window into the snow-quiet dark. Outside, across proper village greens and gas lamp-lit cobbles, the choirs were tuning their final verses. Carolers, wrapped in scarves of dubious knitting legacy, marched gamely from house to house. They sang weather permitting, though permission from sleet was rarely granted. The tunes were old and warm like ancestral quilts. God rest ye merry, gentlemen, which, though everyone forgot the comma, was never meant to suggest deliberately intoxicated men. In some homes, parlors filled with the scent of cinnamon and the clink of modest sherry glasses. Family members gathered around a piano, with the right cousin at the keys and the wrong uncle singing flat. What resulted was less a concert and more a sonic memory for the ages. But hearts were high and goose was basted, which counted for more than harmony. Out on the more fashionable avenues, carriages had ceased clattering hours ago, and tram lines hummed in ghostly rhythm through the frost-laced streets. Shopkeepers, having finally closed up their ribbon-laced windows, strode home with turkey loaves under one arm and modest dreams of a warm slipper under the other. In one particularly poetic moment, a newspaper boy, his cap tugged down to his eyebrows, paused to catch a snowflake on his tongue, then immediately regretted it. Coal smoke is not, it turns out, part of the traditional flavor profile. And so, as chimneys sighed gently with the exhale of 1,000 hearth fires and curtains were drawn with the sleepy creak of old brass hooks, the whole of Edwardian England seemed to pause. The clatter, the laughter, the savoury chaos of pudding dousing. It all began to settle into the still, gold-tinged hush of Christmas Eve night. In a tucked-away corner of Suffolk, a weathered church bell gave a single chime, slow and round as honey, and the stars above, ever punctual, arranged themselves with storybook precision. All across cobbled villages and city crescents alike, candles flickered behind window panes, and the world, for one fleeting hour, felt like something out of a dream. And just as the last note of a carol hovered in the crispy air like a breath half sung, another golden ritual was about to begin, not with fire or figgy pudding, but something gentler still, something involving stockings, quiet footsteps, and a man in a furred red coat. The wind outside rustled like a distant lullaby, brushing the frosted panes of drawing room windows in quiet Edwardian households. It was the sort of wind that made one grateful for indoor pursuits, and few pursuits in 1905 were as uniquely sacred, or occasionally alarming, as playing parlour games by lamplight with relatives you only saw at Christmas, and occasionally wished you didn't. Victorian restraint might have taken its last weary bow after Queen Victoria herself drifted off this mortal coil in 1901. But her spirit lingered, particularly in the drawing room, where polite laughter was compulsory and emotional repression was practically inhaled along with the smell of cinnamon biscuits. In Edwardian England, Christmas social rituals were not simply cherished, they were choreographed. Every movement from passing the brandy butter to pretending to enjoy Uncle Lionel's annual joke, always the same one, about a one-legged goose and an uncooperative chamber pot, was executed with the soft, mahogany-polished grace of middle-class performance art. Nowhere was this better displayed than in the high drama of Christmas parlour games. If one had never experienced the existential terror of being cornered by Aunt Mildred during charades, one could never truly appreciate the era's blend of Christmas cheer and light social panic. Charades, as played in 1905, was less a game and more a battlefield of exaggerated gestures, aggressive giggling, and hapless guessing. When performed by gaslight before a roaring fire, it was Shakespeare meets amateur mime, performed by people who were just mildly tipsy on sherry and under enormous pressure to seem clever. Then came forfeits, a game equally beloved and lightly resented. Each player submitted some personal token, a handkerchief, a cufflink, a slightly damp glove, possibly still warm from the tram ride, and they were held hostage in a hat or bonnet until ridiculous tasks were assigned in exchange. Sing God Save the King in a chicken voice. Hop around Uncle Lionel 3 times while reciting a poem by Tennyson. Propose marriage to the ficus in the corner, which everyone had by that hour begun calling Francis. Laughter would erupt like an overboiled pudding, usually more from relief than amusement. Of course, for the more cerebral members of the gathering, there was the queen of Edwardian party amusements, tableau vivant. This was a pastime that enabled the upper classes to both indulge in historical reenactments and stand perfectly still dressed as Greek myths or medieval tragedies, while everyone admired their ability not to blink for 47 consecutive seconds. Picture the setting. A velvet curtain hastily hung between the parlour door and a chair leg, Mrs. Everleigh Nash in a bedsheet pretending to be the Venus de Milo, and young Tom wearing a biscuit tin like a Roman helmet, all under the artistic direction of someone called Miss Claribel, who had once visited Paris and never quite stopped mentioning it. Everything offered mild chaos under a glaze of tradition, all of it lit by flickering candlelight and that peculiar Edwardian determination to do things the long, complex way, because that's simply how one knew Christmas was happening. And while the children ran half-feral beneath the sideboard, attempting to train the family hound to sit at table, the elders kept time by the grandfather clock and stories of winters gone by. "Do you remember," someone would say, sipping cautiously from a cracked teacup, "when Lady Minton mistook the plum pudding for a hat and tried to wear it at dinner?" They all laughed again, even though it had been 16 years, and the story had grown steadily more pudding than truth. The games continued until a yawn became contagious, and someone stretched beneath the antimacassar by the fireplace. Outside, the snow whispered against the eaves, and all the world turned quieter than an abandoned gramophone. Even stoic old chairs had learned to creak politely, only during lulls in conversation. and so the stockings remained hung. The goose snored contentedly. Yes, there was actually a Christmas goose named Hector in some households, inexplicably kept as a pet after solidarity was declared at the carving board one year. And the lamplight flickered down to its softest golden sigh. Just above the mantel, tucked behind the pine garland dotted with shining orange peels, someone had hidden the sheet music for The Holly and the Ivy. It waited patiently, as traditions often do, ready to play its part once the parlour grew quiet, and the desire to sing met just enough courage and still not quite enough pitch. Tomorrow, perhaps the music would begin. It was on the 15th night of December in 1905 that the final rehearsals for the village nativity took place inside the Letchworth Temperance Hall, a structure so morally upright in architecture that it nearly frowned at its own roof. The walls, slightly bowed from years of righteous choir singing and tea-fueled debates, held in a small bustle of Edwardian children, dressed variously as shepherds, wise men, and a particularly shy camel assembled from two confused schoolboys and Mrs. Penrose's moth-eaten bath mat. The Edwardian nativity play was, ideally, a solemn affair, but in practice, much more amusing. This was an era when dramatics were encouraged only insofar as they remained entirely devoid of emotion. Young Cecil Featherstone, cast as Joseph, delivered all his lines as though he were making a bank withdrawal, and not, in fact, standing beside a swaddled cloth doll named Infant Reginald. Mary, played by 11-year-old Violet Fairweather in constraint-enhancing starch petticoats, gazed beatifically into the audience with all the serenity of knowing her shoes didn't match. They had been rehearsing since mid-November under the benign tyranny of Miss Calliope Marchweather, headmistress of the Letchworth Grammar for Respectable Young Girls and the undisputed empress of organised Christmas. Calliope wore a truly stunning felt poinsettia brooch and was known to strike admiration and mortal fear into the hearts of children, choir masters, and certain types of weak-kneed vicars. Her approach to the nativity was meticulous. All three wise men were forced to learn their gifts in Latin, and consequently could now only remember that myrrh was probably something regrettable involving burial rituals, and the angel chorus had been issued tutting instructions. Sound like you disapprove of sins, but in C major children. In the wings, waiting to go on, the children sipped spoonfuls of barley water and prepared to embody history's most quietly dramatic moment. Well, as dramatically as one could while wearing itchy costumes that smelled faintly of coal and disappointment. The audience, for their part, were already trussed up in layers of wool and anticipation. Parents, grandparents, and that one retired naval officer who showed up to everything in a hopeful blazer were crammed into rows of fold-up chairs that had not been improved by the passage of time or the pursuit of economy. As the lanterns dimmed, though only slightly, as dimming was viewed with vague distrust in certain civic circles, the curtain creaked open to reveal a stable scene so lovingly crafted by the Botany Club that it still had a firmly rooted potted fern smack in one corner. Put tinsel on it, they'd said, and it'll look intentional. It didn't look intentional, but it did look festive. The play commenced. Lines were mostly remembered. The baby was dropped only once, and even then, only onto softly folded hymnals. One of the lambs dozed off mid-song, snoring gently through while shepherds watched, and the Star of Bethlehem, a silver-painted parasol on a fishing rod, moved jerkily across the stage with the majestic grace of a mildly annoyed swan. Afterwards, the reception consisted of homemade biscuits with at least 3 varieties of burnt edges and warm, non-alcoholic punch served in trembling teacups. A great many things that evening were wobbly, tables, punch, performances, but the village sentiment was unanimous. It had been the best nativity in recent, possibly selective memory. While the adults congratulated each other on another year preserved under tinsel and strict propriety, the children ran wild through the hall in their costumes. A small shepherd attempted to trade a paper crown for a strawberry jam sandwich, and negotiations carried on until someone dropped an entire plate of scones. Meanwhile, snow began to fall outside, the quiet kind that made every gas lamp's glow feel like part of a Victorian painting, too sentimental for the Royal Academy. Coal smoke rose lazily from chimneys, and the sound of distant carolers floated from the far end of the high street, turning the memory of the Nativity into something soft, even sacred, despite its grand absurdities. And so the rehearsals ended, the curtain closed, eventually, and Miss Calliope Marchweather retired to her sitting room with a tray of arrowroot biscuits and the firm belief that art, true Edwardian art, was accomplished with restraint, starch, and a camel costume that could be repurposed for Easter. Outside, the world hushed itself into a winter lullaby, and inside, heart settled with the dreamy, gentle satisfaction of tradition well muddled. The night waited, as all proper Edwardian nights did, for the fire to fade slowly and the slippers to be found at last, just in time for a quiet, velvety sort of dream. Soon, in the gentle glow of an oil lamp, not quite extinguished, another story was preparing to unfold, one involving mince pies, mysterious kisses under mistletoe, and a most peculiar Yuletide wager. Picture a long, shivering sigh of a landscape, brushed with frost, and the faint scent of chimney smoke. Along the curving hedgerows of the Edwardian countryside, the mid-winter twilight unfolded like a slow theatre curtain, allowing the more domestic rituals of the season to begin their nightly performance. And among those rituals, the making of plum pudding. Now, the name alone is something of a festive prank. There are rarely plums in a proper plum pudding. It's more of a nostalgic echo, a word that used to mean dried fruits in general, which allows one to forgive the absence of actual plums and focus instead on the warm, sticky majesty of currants, sultanas, raisins, chopped peel, sweet, brown sugar, and brandy, all loyally bound together with a few commanding flourishes of spice. In the kitchens of the well-to-do, the creation of this noble dessert was a production that could rival a royal christening. Mixing Day, also known as Stir-Up Sunday, usually fell 5 weeks before Christmas and was named, rather cleverly, after the collect of the day from the Book of Common Prayer. Stir up, we beseech thee, O Lord, the wills of thy faithful people, which sounds deeply pious until you realize it was used, usefully, to remind cooks and servants that it was time to get cracking on their puddings. Each member of the household would take a turn stirring, traditionally from east to west, said to honor the root of the wise men. Wishes were made in silence while each spoonful was turned. It was all rather mystical, in a batter-smeared sort of way. In grand houses, the cook oversaw the process with the gravitas of a bishop at high altar, surveying a row of chipped stone basins brimming with potential. Little children, cheeks flushed from the chill, queued up to make a wish and sneak a currant. Maids rolled sleeves past elbows. Someone inevitably forgot the breadcrumbs, and someone else, we don't name names, added far too much nutmeg. The pudding would be boiled for hours until its surface took on that noble sheen of thick lacquer that would later soften when doused in brandy and lit, dramatically, just before serving. Ah yes, the lighting of the pudding, possibly the most gleefully perilous part of an Edwardian Christmas. The drawing room lights would be dimmed. A hush would fall, broken only by the pop and hiss of the fire. Then, with theatrical flair, someone's uncle would approach the dessert with the reverence of a cult offering. Brandy, warmed over a candle flame, was poured over the pudding and touched with a match. Suddenly, blue flames, gasps, applause. Several uncles stepping back swiftly to protect their moustaches. It was glorious. Meanwhile, in more modest homes, plum pudding might be a simpler affair. Boiled in a single basin, its ingredients precious and carefully measured. But even here the spirit was the same. The stirring, the hoping. The moment when everyone gathered to share from the same gently steaming centerpiece. The coins hidden inside, a silver sixpence or a lucky threepenny bit, were small fortunes of luck and chance, carefully wrapped in muslin to avoid the dental disasters of yesteryear. And then there were the charms, thimbles for thrift, rings for romance, buttons for eternal bachelorhood. Or so we told ourselves year after year when we got the button again. Interestingly, not everyone adored plum pudding. Some Edwardians suspected it of being just slightly demonic, a stodgy relic of medieval feasting, too rich for the modern constitution. Doctors occasionally issued stern warnings about the dangers of pudding fatigue, a legitimate Edwardian concern that combined overindulgence with moral self-flagellation. Still, most gave in at least once, unable to resist the siren call of moist fruit and flaming spectacle. In quieter homes, where hearth and tradition sang softly together, the pudding served as punctuation. It was not just dessert, it was a pageant, a shared ritual, a fragrant monument to everything cozy and overcooked and resolutely British. It told stories without needing to speak, stories of years past, of grandmothers with patient hands, of lost coins and found wishes, steaming windows and candlelit tables. And so, as the last spoon scrapes mournfully against the empty bowl, and someone remarks that they couldn't possibly eat another bite, unless perhaps there's a bit more custard, the house settles into a post-pudding hush, a soft satisfaction like snow falling on already blanketed fields. Outside, the frost climbs higher on the windows. Inside, the pudding has done its work. And upstairs, nestled away in trunks and wardrobes, await the festive garments of glimmering potential, waiting, quite fashionably, for their chance at Christmas glory, in the warm, amber afterglow of the parlor fire, where the gas lamps murmured their quiet halo of light and distant wind tiptoed against the panes. The Edwardians found pleasure in the art of gift-giving, not the frenzied plastic-wrapped battlefield we know today, but a slower, softer ritual of thoughtfulness and Victorian hangovers. By 1905, the act of giving gifts at Christmas had matured from a polite whisper to a gentle, decorous dance. The Industrial Revolution had, quite without intending to, placed an entire universe of trinkets within arm's reach of the middle class. Mass production meant you no longer had to whittle a squirrel out of birchwood for Aunt Ethel. Now you could purchase an actual glass squirrel with shiny eyes and possibly some questionable paint for just a few shillings. Unlike their Victorian predecessors, who often exchanged handmade corset covers stitched from pure anxiety, the Edwardians leaned into the idea of practical charm. A decent hairbrush was a prime example of an acceptable gift. You might receive a hairbrush or a comb, or, if passions ran high, both in a matched tortoiseshell set with your initials engraved. Practical but dazzling, like saying, "Darling, I care enough about you to want you well groomed." Children, those little messengers of sugar and chaos, typically received toys that had just the right balance of delight and moral instruction. French dolls in hulking layers of fashion, sometimes more stylish than the actual French, were beloved by girls, along with miniature cook stove sets designed to ignite lifelong domestic ambitions. Boys, meanwhile, found joy in toy soldiers, model locomotives, and, if someone was feeling particularly progressive, a chemistry kit that could, with luck and ventilation, rearrange your eyebrows. Books were always a graceful default. Nothing screamed intellectual affection in Edwardian society like a handsomely bound volume of poetry, or perhaps a rather stern tale involving an orphan, a governess, and an unexpected inheritance. Edith, the middle Bradstone sister, once received a copy of Middlemarch bound in tooled leather and promptly used it as a secret place to stash sweets she didn't wish to share. Thus, George Eliot became the unknowing guardian of candied plums and Turkish delight. Literature, after all, is best enjoyed with something sticky tucked between the pages. Department stores had become the unsung heroes of the holiday season. Liberties in London shimmered like a cathedral of temptation. Harrods wrapped your pre-wrapped dreams in ribbon and politeness. For the vast suburban sprawl, a new marvel existed, the mail order catalogue, that bound miracle of consumer freedom. If you lived miles from civilization, or as far as Croydon, you could still order a self-heating teapot or a velvet workbox, and it would find you like a dedicated suitor with punctual boots. There was a definite sense of restraint, though. Edwardians took pride in discretion. One was to feel moved without feeling overwhelmed, delighted, but not, heaven forbid, surprised beyond what a firm upper lip could handle. No one wanted Aunt Beatrice fainting over an unexpected wicker hamper. Wrapping paper was often reused, because austerity was next to godliness, and besides, look at the price of that pretty blue stuff. Ribbons were kept for decades and might have once strangled a bonnet before adjusting to life as gift decor. Tags were handwritten with a flourish and perhaps faintly scented like mothballs and lavender from their drawer exile. Amongst all this, the joy wasn't really in what was given, but the ceremony of it. The crackle of anticipation as packages were unwrapped. The chorus of, "Oh, how lovely, exactly what I needed," delivered even when the contents were questionably ceramic. It was never the cucumber-shaped soap dish. It was that someone remembered you liked cucumbers, or soap, or both. Later, gifts would be tucked away, the parlour tidied, and the fire poked back into life by someone who trained under the mystical order of poke-stabbers and ash-mop attendants. Tea would be poured, and hand-stitched slippers finally deployed. And above it all, like a helter-skelter star atop a very symmetrical tree, floated a soft sense of contentment, the quiet, lacquered glow of people who had chosen to care with small, sparkling gestures. Not grand, just enough. Somewhere amid the clink of china and the faint sighs of well-fed spaniels, there was talk of the Boxing Day outing, a tradition unto itself that involved sandwiches, scarves, and the illusion of athleticism. But that's a tale for just a little later, a story folded neatly with mittens and woolen socks. There was a certain quiet magic that befell Edwardian drawing rooms after the plum pudding had retired and the mince pies had lost their steam. The Christmas desserts had been conquered, the parlour games subdued, and the scent of pine needles mingled with paraffin from the lamps. A heady, festive fog that curled through the velvet drapes and lingered in every brass doorknob. And it was in these quiet corners of post-supper contentment that the art of storytelling, that most ancient, twinkle-lit tradition, came to life. In 1905, seasonal storytelling was not the high-octane thriller business it is today. No one craned forward waiting for a plot twist involving a missing heirloom or a surprise engagement. In fact, no one craned much at all. Most leaned back, deeper into the settee, beneath a crocheted blanket, the fringe tickling their ankles, swaddled in a brandy-laced haze of nostalgia. The stories told by candlelight weren't new. Oh no, heavens forbid. They were delightfully aged, like a Stilton left too long on the sideboard. They were told every year and somehow got worse each time, which only made them better. There was something delicious in the fumbled details, in the way Uncle Percy could never seem to remember where the goose ended and the chimney sweep began. Some stories recounted the Great Snow of 81, which, depending on the age and exaggeration of the speaker, either blocked every door from Brighton to Berwick, or just gave the cat a mild surprise. Others were ghostly tales in the fashion of Mr. Dickens, but with a more pastoral gloom. One tale featured a spectral postman who still delivered Boxing Day letters to a house that had burned down in 1887. The ghost postman, someone always added after a pause, wore galoshes, because of course, even the dead respected English weather. Children perched near the hearth with sticky fingers and sideways glances at the walnut bowl. The older ones, teetering on the fragile edge between belief and enlightened cynicism, whispered theories to each other. Was Aunt Kitty's ghost actually just her husband in a nightshirt? Why did the mysterious candle always blow out at the same moment Father raised his eyebrows? Some households rehearsed their Christmas tales like little plays. Granny would don her theatrical shawl and wobble her voice through a dozen characters, each more Scottish than the last, regardless of geography. There was always a dog, usually with an absurd name like Pickle Whip, and a plot twist involving an ancient cracker pulled 2 weeks early. The climax often turned on a pudding curse or a vicar with a secret fondness for sherry custard. Outside the frosted window panes, the world had its own story. A hedgehog might trundle under the hedge, utterly indifferent to the traditions of human storytelling. The snowflakes, precise and symmetrical, like aristocratic dandruff, flurried and danced, each with its own forgettable adventure, none of them aware they were composing the dreamy closing chapter of a déjà vu December. Back inside, someone, usually a cousin who misunderstood tone, attempted an original tale. These generally fizzled halfway through when a character named Geoffrey turned into two separate but equally unconvincing ghosts. There would be polite coughing, a brisk change of subject to how fine the holly looked this year, and eventually a gentle migration toward the tea tray. It's important to remember that in 1905, people lived far more in the moment because the wireless hadn't yet started bossing everyone around with news or arias. Distractions were tactile. A rattling coal scuttle, a drippy candle that insisted on leaning toward the wallpaper, or the slow but spirited collapse of a card table due to a badly engineered leg. Storytelling evenings wove themselves into the family mythos like actual embroidery, a bit lumpy, slightly uneven, but proudly framed nonetheless. And whether the tale was barely 6 sentences or wandered through 4 unrelated Christmases, there was always that lovely, lingering silence at the end. A silence that said nothing needed fixing. Not the story, not the moment, not even Uncle Percy's geography. One could sit in that hush forever, chin cradled in one's hand, feet finally warm in borrowed slippers, letting the echoes of overcooked imagination tap gently at the corners of the mind. It was a silence made of crackling logs, melted chocolates, and the distant shuffle of snow being considered by the roof. And as the fire dipped lower and the shadows played theatrics on the antimacassars, another story was brewing, a quieter one perhaps, one that began not with a ghost or a goose, but with something far more Edwardian, a carefully written letter sealed with wax, waiting quietly on a side table, its sender unknown, its contents yearning to be read. Even in the frostbitten embrace of an Edwardian winter, when chimney smoke curled like lazy, graphite squiggles against a pewter sky, the British postman was a creature of mythological endurance. One could argue that the true sleigh of Father Christmas wasn't drawn by reindeer at all. It had a satchel full of paper and a slightly annoyed gentleman named Reginald trudging up a hill in Norwich. For by December 1905, the Edwardians had fully embraced the delightful madness of the Christmas card. What began as a simple Victorian innovation had by now bloomed into a bombardment. In every home with a snug parlour and a decently dusted whatnot shelf, cards appeared like festive fungi. They came by post, by hand, and occasionally by mistake to the wrong address, which no one truly minded. The idea was volume, a blizzard of sentiment, odd and whimsical and occasionally inappropriate. Christmas cards then were a curious breed. Though one might expect all things nativity and snow, the Edwardian taste veered more delightfully bizarre. Yes, there were robins and boughs of holly, but there were also frogs in waistcoats ice skating, cats conducting orchestras, and, somewhat inexplicably, geese delivering gifts in top hats. It was an aesthetic less focused on religious significance and more on gentle surrealism. The Edwardian logic seemed to be, if it makes Aunt Margaret chuckle and doesn't frighten the baby, onto a card it goes. Some cards even bore lush calligraphy describing curious local legends or odd proverbs about turnips. The production of these cards had become a minor industry. In elegant workshops that smelled faintly of glue and ambition, lithographers hunched over their presses with practiced flair. Glitter dust was applied, real pulverized glass at times, because nothing says seasonal joy quite like a sprinkling of ocular danger. Children, of course, were eager accomplices in this annual exchange. Schoolrooms buzzed with glue pots, blunt scissors, and the gentle panic of crooked handwriting. To Grandmama with Yuletide love, wrote young Bertie, who had valiantly guessed the spelling of both Yuletide and love. Meanwhile, the adult population approached the card-sending ritual with a sense of civic duty bordering on the clerical. Mantelpieces were transformed into shrines of cheerful paper. Mallard ducks in bonnets wished you prosperity. Victorian cherubs offered ambiguous winks. One could gauge a family's standing in the community by the yawning breadth of their Christmas card array, second only to the size of their pudding basin collection. And still, the postman marched on. It is believed that December 22nd of 1905 saw a record number of deliveries in Britain, some 7 postal deliveries a day in larger towns, and one couldn't help but admire the red-faced determination of those brave souls adventuring through the sleet. Small children in mufflers would press gingerbread into their gloved hands while mothers looked on fondly, as if to say, "This is England. We mail things in bulk." Within the walls of a modestly comfortable Edwardian drawing room, perhaps belonging to the Tilley family of Tunbridge Wells, or the slightly less coordinated Everetts of Merthyr Tydfil, a child might have spent a winter's evening selecting a card for each relation. Aunt Clara, well known for spoon collecting and rarely laughing above a whisper, would receive a picture of a stern angel glaring meaningfully at a plum pudding. Uncle Geoffrey, who once attempted to dress their basset hound as Queen Victoria for a pageant, would be blessed with 3 monkeys riding a tricycle under mistletoe. The tactile rituals of the season, dipping a pen into inky permanence, selecting a stamp with the precision of a military maneuver, walking to the postbox while trying not to trip on one's own gaiters, were all part of the charm. There was a quiet pride in it. Christmas, after all, was not a performance, it was a participation. And so, Edwardian Britain lay blanketed in both snow and stationery, with the crackle of the hearth and the scent of paraffin lamps mixing dreamily with the shimmer of 1,000 absurd postcards. Slumber approached with a smirk. Outside, in the unhurried hush of the evening, a single robin perched on a wrought iron gate watched a postman vanish down the street, humming a carol no one remembered but everyone still knew. The last card posted, the last envelope sealed. Nearly all was ready. Tomorrow would awaken to preparations of quite another kind. Feasts and fiddles and puddings yet unwrapped. But tonight, the ink is still drying, and peace is contentedly enclosed in an envelope of snow. Snow lay thick across the hedgerows of Gloucestershire, muffling all sound like a woolen scarf pulled snug around the neck of the world. The sheep were grateful, or at least would have been, had they possessed any social awareness. But instead, they simply huddled in their shelters, which smelled, shall we say, distinctly pastoral. Inside the drawing rooms of Edwardian country houses, however, things were far more civilized. Tea steamed, the grandfather clock ticked with elderly dignity, and Agnes Mildred Penrose, age 72 and absolutely winning at whist, was about to scandalize the vicar over lemon sponge. The Edwardian Christmas of 1905 had reached its decadent peak, and nowhere was that better demonstrated than in the parlors, where post-carol boredom collided with pudding-fueled energy. The rituals of the season were lovingly preserved, of course, but when you've sung God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen approximately 247 times, the mind begins to wander, sometimes dangerously, into competitive charades, or worse, 19th century magic tricks involving raw eggs and actual confusion. In one particular house party, at the rather over-decorated estate of Lord Wendell Butterham, the after-dinner entertainment had taken a decidedly strange turn. Lord Butterham, who prided himself on being both a liberal thinker and the owner of one of the earliest electric floor lamps in Sussex, had invited Professor Hieronymus Pilkington to deliver what he called a spectacular lecture for the morally upright. It was, among other things, about snowflakes. Now, before you nod off, understand that in 1905, snow wasn't just something that clogged your boots. It was a subject of profound mystery. Victorian and Edwardian scholars had peered through magnifying glasses at snow crystals with the same sort of reverence normally reserved for classical sculpture or a particularly attractive postage stamp. Professor Pilkington clicked open a brass lantern projector, which, after a few groans and one alarming puff of smoke, sent an image of a snowflake, enlarged to the size of a coat of arms, onto the dining room wall. "Observe," he proclaimed, his voice wobbling with excitement and sponge cake. "Nature's own architecture." The crowd murmured, some impressed and others merely digesting brandy sauce. One gentleman, a Mr. Lionel Parsnip of Derbyshire, leaned over to whisper that the snowflake looked exactly like the wallpaper, which he suspected meant his wife had been more fashionable than he'd realized. Professor Pilkington went on to explain that no two snowflakes were alike, to which Agnes Mildred Penrose confidently replied that the same could be said for the muffins she made every Thursday. "Some come out glorious," she whispered to the vicar, "and some resemble feet." Meanwhile, as the snowflake lecture reached its thrilling crescendo, featuring a particularly bold claim that snowflakes were theatrically adjacent to cathedral windows. Several of the younger guests crept quietly away to the billiard room, where they planned to stage an impromptu performance of Macbeth with sock puppets. Such was the way of things in an Edwardian Christmas, a rigid schedule of tradition, frequently but politely subverted by whimsy. And speaking of subversion, even the most reserved homes had started dabbling in what was, in 1905, the height of modernity, the Christmas cracker. Ah yes, those festive paper tubes that exploded with a charming pop or a pitiful snap, depending on their constitution, and unveiled tiny paper crowns, tin toys, or jokes written with all the wit of a distracted librarian. "Why did the goose cross the road?" one asked. "To escape the stuffing," came the answer. It was not hilarious, but it was seasonal. Guests wore their paper crowns with ceremonial gravity, as if accepting knighthood for their endurance of boiled cabbage. The corgis, because of course there were corgis, found these colourful headpieces wildly threatening and barked accordingly, until offered sausage rolls. Outside, the snow glittered under the moonlight, a light frost now tattooing the edges of every critique of the evening's roast. A thin trail of smoke rose from every chimney as the night settled deeper into itself, like a cat curling against the hearth. Upstairs, ladies removed their jeweled hairpins while men folded their cravats with a laziness that bordered on invention. And still, somewhere in the background, Professor Pilkington could be heard discussing crystals of moral grandeur, only now to an audience consisting solely of the butler, who was asleep standing up. And so, with another log tossed onto the fire and the household slowly surrendering to the hush of winter sleep, tomorrow's plans were pondered quietly beneath the eiderdowns, plans involving sleigh rides, syllabub, and, most controversially, possibly even charades involving animal noises. But that, of course, is still tucked gently on the other side of midnight. Upstairs, in the quiet drawing rooms and half-lit parlors of Edwardian England, another curious Christmas tradition flickered into being, the seasonal séance. Yes, you heard that right. Ghosts for Christmas were not just reserved for Dickensian storytelling. In 1905, while holly berries adorned the walls and wassail bubbled in the punch bowl, a not insignificant number of families devoted at least part of their merriment to communicating, politely of course, with the dead. Spiritualism, you see, was terribly fashionable among the Edwardian middle and upper classes. Alongside their pudding and port, many a household served up just a hint of the beyond. And what better time than Christmas? It was, after all, a season of reflection, family togetherness, and messaging distant relatives, whether in Yorkshire or the great beyond. Picture Aunt Mildred seated by the fire, clutching a lorgnette in one hand and dabbing discreetly at her eyes with the other, murmuring about that one visit to a medium in Kensington who seemed quite certain that Cousin Edwin was now peacefully residing in the afterlife, somewhere between the garden terrace and a cleverly disguised bureau. It was all very civil and stiff upper-lipped. The séance table was often the same mahogany furniture used for afternoon tea, only now it bore candles and the occasional trembling teacup. Participants clasped gloved hands, closed their eyes, and waited, solemnly, for the knock, the rapping, or the gentle sound of someone faintly humming, "God rest ye merry, gentlemen," from under the floorboards. Of course, not all Edwardians were true believers. Many participated more for fashion than for faith. Think of it like crystal healing, but with more lace doilies. There was a charming blend of sincerity and performance, a ghostly pantomime for the well-read and well-bred. And if something knocked on the wall, well, it might be Uncle Humphrey from the other side, or more likely, the family cat dislodging a tacky pine garland from the mantelpiece. Still, the Victorians had made spiritualism positively respectable, and Edwardians were determined not to be outdone. Famous figures, authors, thinkers, even a few lawmakers, dabbled in otherworldly correspondence. The Society for Psychical Research, founded just a couple decades prior, still held devoted members combing through séance transcripts with all the gravity of parliamentary minutes. It was serious nonsense taken quite seriously. And yet, there was something oddly comforting in these frost-flecked rituals. In a season filled with endings and beginnings, it made a sort of poetic sense to reflect on those who'd come before, even if you preferred they didn't rearrange the crockery from beyond the veil. Outside, the world was curling softly into night. Smoke drifted lazily from brick chimneys. A fox perhaps stepped across a snow-blanketed garden, invisible among the lengthening shadows of box hedges and bare-branched elms. Indoors, the séance had ended. Someone lit another candle near the Christmas cards. The same plump, silver-haired lady who'd summoned the spirit of great-grandfather Augustus was now deeply engrossed in a new knitting project, something between a muff and a knee blanket, with a vigour suggesting she'd had quite enough paranormal activity for one evening. Children, meanwhile, peered warily around doorways, still convinced they'd seen the Christmas goose move ever so slightly on its platter at dinner. A snowman outside lost its carrot nose to the local Labrador. A phonograph whirred back to life, spinning out a fragile rendition of "O Come All Ye Faithful," while someone in the hall tried valiantly to locate their left galoche. And just like that, the solemn whisperings of the séance slipped easily into less spectral chatter. What's for breakfast tomorrow? Did anyone wrap Cousin Lily's book? Has the cat eaten one of the goose decorations again? The Edwardian Christmas was like that. A mad, marvellous blend of the remote and the ridiculous. Antiques mixed with innovation. Spirit boards beside sugar mice. Sable-trimmed coats hung next to ticking coal scuttles. The veil between worlds, both social and spiritual, felt easiest to lift on nights like these, when the wind sighed in the chimneys and generations, both living and not, seemed to huddle close in the firelight. The last candle was extinguished with a whisper. The séance table was repurposed once more for morning tea. Leave it to the Edwardians to keep things both versatile and ghost-friendly. And somewhere in the house, far beneath the quiet eaves of the Christmas night, a clock ticked smoothly toward the next curious custom, waiting just out of sight, as Christmas Day gave way to Boxing Day in the winter of 1905. The Edwardians, having survived the goose, the pudding, and an aunt's aggressive kiss on the cheek, turned their attention to a lesser-known but vitally important tradition: doing absolutely nothing. Not nothing in the existential sense, mind you. More of a determined ceremonial inactivity, executed in waistcoats and flannel nightgowns. Boxing Day, in its Edwardian incarnation, was less about haunting department store clearance aisles and more about long walks, leftover consumption, and an enthusiastic dedication to mild card games. While the servants may have received their token boxes, the origins of the day's name, the well-heeled Edwardians mainly used the day to recover from their festive overexertions, and possibly to complain mildly about them. After all, there's only so many rounds of blind man's bluff before Uncle Reginald ends up with a broken sugar bowl, and someone has to write to Aunt Flora about it. The country estates, now blanketed in a soft, crunching snow, lay hush with the rare sound of silence, the parlors thinned of merrymakers. The pianoforte was mercifully left alone, its keys cooling at last after 2 days of valiant duty playing carols only half remembered by guests progressively less in tune. Love it or loathe it, dinner had been served, devoured, and dissected. And now, as the fire settled into glowing embers and slippered feet pressed into worn hearth rugs, the Edwardians did what they did best. They sat and contemplated digestive biscuits. There was a particular serenity to this December stillness, as sherry was sipped with the kind of philosophical slowness that suggested one was tasting the very idea of the British Empire in a tiny glass. Outside, the snow chuckled down gently, layering hedgerows and boot prints, as if the world were being tucked into its own great feather bed. Even the foxes padded softly tonight, perhaps struck silent by the sheer amount of roast beef their human neighbours had consumed. In London, those not enjoying rural retreats leaned into the urban version of rest. The city, usually thrumming with horseshoes and rapid footsteps, was now drowsy. Basket boys from the market chuckled under breath clouds, tradesmen tipped their caps more leisurely, and the costermongers sang less about mussels and more about going home early. Even the post arrived with a sort of dreamy reluctance, sniffing the cold and pretending not to carry several dozen thank you for the socks notes. And then, of course, came a distinctly Edwardian sport: speculation for the new year. Nothing quite stirred the vacuum of Boxing Day like inventing one's own resolutions with proper English vagueness. A gentleman might inform the drawing room that he planned to take up cycling, though he had no bicycle and less intention. Ladies were more precise in their ambiguity. More letters, fewer crumpets, one might proclaim nobly, nibbling both a pen and a crumpet with equal determination. It was, if we are being honest, a sort of peaceful performance art, a day of half promises, fully reclined, of leftover jelly and psychological digestion, and always someone would suggest a walk. This was met with vague noises that communicated nothing and everything: mild interest, polite disapproval, reflective gas-induced regret. Eventually, coats would be buttoned, hats donned, and small knots of people would drift toward the lanes, wondering aloud whether that ice looked sturdy or sinister. If you are lucky, you may hear the echo of a conversation from that chilly stroll in your own thoughts tonight. Tokens of Edwardian complexity disguised as simplicity. I believe the milkman said there's a goose missing. Remarkable, wild, suspiciously domesticated if you ask me. Back at the house, the fires licked low again. Not so much burning as daydreaming. The dog snored beside the Aga and let out the occasional faint bark that suggested a dream of chasing sheep, or possibly chasing the concept of sheep. And somehow, in that curious post-holiday hush, the Edwardians practiced something we might admire today: the idle art of staying still. No productivity hacks, no urgent post-season sales. Just humanity in its warmest slippers, listening to the tick of the grandfather clock and probably wondering if the cheese from Tuesday was still edible. And so, within this quiet chamber of Boxing Day ritual, where the tea cools and the air settles into a gently comforting musk of nutmeg and damp wool, we find one more secret of an Edwardian Christmas. It wasn't all brass bands and blazing puddings. Sometimes it was just largely horizontal. As the evening settles and night draws its drapes tighter over the Edwardian rooftops, let us quietly draw near the parlour once again. Embers faintly glow. Steam curls from a final pot of cocoa. And something faint, perhaps a promise, or just the creak of the house, ushers us gently forward, toward the last flickering moment of the Edwardian holiday dream. And so, on the quiet twilight of Boxing Day, 1905, when the last brown chestnut had popped in the fire and children's cheeks were still smudged with pudding, the Edwardian Christmas inched toward its velvety conclusion with the slow grace of a sleepy cat kneading a hearth rug. The air outside had the crisp hush of snow not quite yet. There had been rumours, of course. Grandmama's bunions had twinged, and the house butler swore he'd heard a thrush sing in reverse. But inside, warmth ruled. Fires crackled softly behind curved Art Nouveau grates, and gas lamps flickered like curious whispers across wall-papered parlors dressed for the season. Tinsel glimmered like mischievous moonlight. In the Edwardian era, it was still real metal, actual tinsel, mind you. Not the flimsy plastic ribbon of later years, but thin strands of silver-plated copper that could conduct electricity if one were both reckless and trying very hard. Dinner had long ago ended in a symphony of satisfied sighs, clinking port glasses, and one unfortunate cousin who misjudged a brandied fig and added slightly tipsy ruddy nose to the evening's tableau. Around him, merry uncle types chuckled beneath handlebar moustaches that had seen at least 2 decades of dedication and 1 accidental dip in treacle. In parlours up and down England, pianofortes were now softly echoing the slower carols, no longer the jaunty falalas, but the lullaby ones. In the bleak midwinter, for example, with its tender melody and lyrics that felt written by someone wearing mittens, and Silent Night, translated from German, a peacemaking gesture in this pre-war, post-Victorian moment that still believed music might prevent inconvenient things like assassinations and alliances. Even the servants, those silent orchestrators of almost everything, found slivers of rest. Some gathered with family near the scullery's makeshift tree, a potted rosemary bush strung with tiny ribbons, and an orange pilfered from breakfast. They sang their own songs, passed down orally and stubbornly unrecorded by any official caroling society. Beneath the grand house hierarchy, whole worlds of celebratory folklore lived, a humbler, heartier kind of Christmas. Back upstairs, young ones, glazed with sugar and contentment, had been tucked beneath mountain ranges of woolen blankets. Light filtered through frosted panes and cast dreamy patterns on nursery walls. A teddy bear observed solemnly from a rocking chair. Dolls slumped in post-feast benediction. Somewhere, a mechanical train lost its steam and came to a decisive rest. Peace did not descend upon the house. It was already there, curled up in the corners like a dozing ginger cat. In those quiet hours, the ritual slowed. Fathers pulled on slippers monogrammed for Christmas morning, courtesy of discreet shopmen and long-suffering footmen. Mothers unfastened the last stubborn hook and eye and slipped into dressing gowns so enveloping they could banish entire Novembers. Letters were penned, on thick cream paper, to cousins in India, aunts in Scotland, and that one friend in New York whose surname no one had quite learned to pronounce, but whose holiday box of pecans always arrived with uncanny punctuality. Even Parliament was asleep, or at least severely drowsy. No speeches, no telegrams requiring urgent replies. Just Lord Watch's name nodding off in a club chair, one boot polished, the other still theoretical. One could almost feel the entire empire exhale. And truly, this was the heart of the Edwardian Christmas. Not merely the grandeur or the goose-fat roastings or the holly-strewn invitations, but that final day or two when society loosened its corsets, figuratively and quite literally, when postmen finally put up their feet, and when even the most ambitious socialites stopped cold calling on baronets and instead fell asleep beside the fire with a forgotten crumpet on her lap. It was not a perfect time, nor an entirely equitable one, but for a precious moment each winter, amid the scent of orange peel and a distant chorus carried on fog, people allowed themselves the decadent act of rest. No telegrams, no continents, no coal debates, just the sound of the wind outside and the old grandfather clock inside saying, "Hush, hush, hush." And so ends our gentle excursion through the snow-dusted lanes of Edwardian Christmas, where falling asleep wasn't a defeat, but a grand seasonal tradition. Now, let your own mind slip beneath its blanket. There'll be no calls tonight, no pages to turn, only silence, and perhaps the imagined sounds of a pianoforte in the distance, finishing its final refrain.